We're going to get started. Thank you all for coming out tonight. My name is Jennifer Scott. I am the director of Jane Addams Hull-House Museum. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the museum, we are a tribute to Jane Addams, Ellen Gates Starr, and all the radical and social reformer women who came to this area of Chicago in the 1880s, late 1880s, to try to create social change and make the city and the world a better place by working with the immigrants who were in this area at the time, struggling with all sorts of issues of oppression, xenophobia and racism, labor oppression, gender oppression. And the social reformers enacted social change by offering extensive skill-building activities, arts and cultural activities and classes, social services, but they also advocated for policy changes. So everything that we do today at the museum connects this past of the social reformers of the progressive era to present-day social justice issues. And certainly school closures is one of those. So the program tonight is in conjunction with our current contemporary exhibition that some of you might have seen right before the program tonight next door, called Claiming Space, Creative Grounds, and Summer Freedom School. This exhibition is working with Hull-House has had the honor to bring together activists and educators and researchers and artists to take on the issue of school closures on the West Side. So Creative Grounds is an ensemble that's actually trying to track that information so that we can be informed citizenry, so we can make our choices and the best interventions into how to make a difference into navigating our education landscapes. We're also working with Sumner Elementary School, a school on the West Side that was designated for closure, but was spared because it was high performing. And if you went to the exhibition, you'll see a lot of their artwork exhibited, and their reimagining of how they see their world through wallpaper, working with a contemporary artist, Leah Gibson, to create and imagine a different place in their neighborhood. So I encourage you to see that. You have a few more months if you haven't already. This is part 2 of a series of conversations that we're having in conjunction with the exhibition on racial equity and education in Chicago's public schools. So the first one, how many of you came to the first one? Oh, good. We have a few repeat customers. Yay. The first one was revisiting Brown v. Board in the present and looking at the persistence and different permutations of racial segregation in Chicago since the 1954 decision. And the next one in April will specifically look at the moratorium, the ending of the moratorium that just occurred. So we encourage you to come back. This particular conversation tonight is actually part 2 of another series that Amara was a part of last year that was bridging divides between the West Side and the South Side, looking at our differences and distinctions, but also figuring out how to bridge some of those differences. And one of the things that came out of the conversation was that it's a great thing to coalition around would be school closures. So that has informed us, helped us. We listened to you, and that's one of the main reasons why we were able to do the exhibition that we have on display right now. And we're having another, we knew immediately that we needed to do another conversation, a follow-up conversation, because West Side and South Side organizations are coalitioning around school closures, and there can be so many more possibilities. So that's really the discussion tonight. All of this is part of a larger project called Making the West Side Community Conversations on Neighborhood Change. We started almost 3 years ago here at Hull-House that's putting neighborhood history in conversation with neighborhood change and really trying to look at the development of communities and neighborhoods to understand what we can do in the present to make a difference. We have almost monthly conversations, and we're doing more and more on the West, focusing on the West Side, because we're on the near West Side, and it's a way for us also to re-engage with our own history. So now I have the honor of introducing our moderator, who will introduce you to the panel. Dr. Amara Enyia is a public policy consultant, and she writes extensively on issues of community and economic development, public policy, and systems thinking. She also serves as executive director of Austin Chamber of Commerce. She served as executive director for the nonprofit Austin Coming Together and worked as policy director in the advanced manufacturing sector around large-scale development projects, workforce development, education, and community-driven economic development. Dr. Enyia received a bachelor's degree in broadcast journalism, political science, and news editorial, a law degree in international law and development, a master's degree in education, and a PhD in education and policy studies. Very credentialed. Amara is also one of our favorite advocates of the West Side, so she's also a repeat customer of ours. And we're very happy to have her back tonight. The last time she was here, she didn't have a voice. We want everybody to have a voice. So please please join me in welcoming Amara Enyia.
So I'm very glad to be here. Thank you, Jennifer, for the introduction. Yes, the last time I was here, I could only participate using mimes and hand signals. So I'm glad to actually have a voice this time. And I'm even more excited to be able to introduce you to really an excellent panel of experts, people who have been doing this work, who have the kind of context that will help us have a better understanding of what's happening around education in Chicago, particularly on the South and West sides. And so what I want to do is just a little bit of housekeeping. You should have received a card. And I think Jennifer will help to facilitate the process of filling out those cards, to write your questions down, and they'll be collecting. You'll be collecting the cards throughout the program. So if you write them down, you can hand them. They'll be walking through the audience, so that we can incorporate some of your questions throughout the discussion. We'll start with some overview, some context to help you to understand what is happening in Chicago on the different sides of the city as it relates to the school closings. And then we'll do a deep dive into the issues so that we can pull out some of the nuances between the activities that are happening on the West Side, the actions that are happening on the South Side, both from an organizer standpoint, but also from an organizational standpoint. And finally, the goal is to hopefully leave here with a sense of optimism about what the landscape for education could look like moving forward, as well as a call to action for those of you who have been engaged in these issues or are looking for ways to get more engaged on these issues on any side of the city. But first, I want to give everyone an opportunity, our panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves. I'll just go quickly down the list and then they'll introduce themselves one by one. So we have Dr. Elisabeth Greer, we have Candace Moore, Simone Woods, and Byron Sigcho. So we'll just go down the line and you can just do a brief background, who you are, the work that you've been doing in this space for the benefit of our audience. I think next there.
Okay, it is on. Okay, can everyone hear me? All right, hello everyone. My name is Elisabeth Greer. Professionally, I'm an associate professor of English at Harold Washington College downtown. And personally, I am the chair of the local school council at National Teachers Academy, which, if you do not know, was just voted on by CPS to close. We are a level 1+ school. Elementary school with a 75% African American, 75% low income population, situated just on the south of the South Loop. So that is why I'm being here today to talk to you about this unprecedented situation. It was funny when Jennifer said that Sumner was pulled off the closing list because it was high performing, and we are the highest performing school according to CPS's rating, and yet we are still scheduled to be closed. Also, I am the co-founder of Chicago United for Equity, one of 3, and we are an organization that is dedicated to racial equality, racial equity, and also to educational equity around the city. So, thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Simone Woods. So what brings me to this conversation? Currently, I'm working at an organization called Communities in Schools of Chicago, just up the street here. And my interest in this conversation is I am currently and have been in the past working in a school on the west side of Chicago. I've also worked in schools on the south side, numerous communities. So I've been able to kind of experience some school closings from that ground level and really just being able to feel the pulse of what's going on in the community, school community, as well as the outside community. I'm also a long-term resident of Austin, the Austin community, which, as some of you may know, was greatly impacted by the school closures a few years ago. We actually, I think, had, was it four elementary schools that closed in that community. So not only do I work in the schools with the population, but I also live in the community, and I'm here with that in mind. Also, I'm a lover of education and lover of Chicago, so that's significant to me as well.
Well, good afternoon. This is an honor to be here with a great group of people. Amara also quite well for different fights. And it is, in my role, I'm an immigrant. I'm a resident of Pilsen. I live in Pilsen. How I ended up here, I guess, is I currently the director of the Pilsen Alliance, but back then, I'm still now working a lot of schools in the southwest side and the south side and west side as well, as a teacher, as an adult educator at UIC. So we've seen firsthand a lot of the impact that the decisions made by the unelected school board of education has taken. Gone to numerous hearings and during the school closings that supposedly were 130 originally ended up being 50. We fought very hard to keep our schools open. There were 2 schools in Pilsen, and grassroots organizing is really what kept those schools open. Because even today we're still struggling with this issue of the displacement. 10,000 residents in Pilsen have left. 2,000 children have been displaced from our public schools. So this is displacement of massive proportions. So grassroots organizing is one of the things I'd like to talk to you about, and how I learned as a teacher and then became somewhat of an organizer. And it's great to be here to discuss about these issues.
Hi everyone, my name is Candace Moore. I'm a staff attorney with the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. Our organization, we're lawyers advocating for racial equity and economic opportunities. I work specifically on our education equity project. Throughout our work, we've done a lot of work across the city around discipline, but more recently, we've been working with communities around some of the school closings, particularly National Teachers Academy. We do our work through a lens that we call community lawyering. It's sort of this idea of, I think people's traditional notions of lawyers is that they sort of come in and try to be know-it-alls, but really challenging that paradigm and thinking about lawyers as supports and tools for community to use to advocate for the goals and the outcomes that they have decided. And so it's really important for us to do that work in coalition, following and working with the leadership of community to figure out the best strategy to move forward. So I feel like National Teachers Academy has been an incredible lesson learned for me in community lawyering, one in which I want to share on the panel, but also just really thinking about the landscape of school closings across the south and west side, and some strategic strategies that we as a community could be looking at in terms of trying to impact structures.
Thank you so much for that introduction. For all of you, there's so much that you have to bring to this conversation that I'm hoping we can all learn from. I want to start with just getting right into this notion of organizing. So in 2013, for all of you here, CPS closed schools across the city. Many schools were affected, elementary schools, and a lot of organizing started then. We also had this year where, as you've heard with National Teachers Academy, for those of you who are also familiar with what happened in Inglewood with the proposal to shut down all of the high schools for a year, and then that was dialed back to a phase out of 3 of the high schools. And so there's a repetitiveness about how we're organizing or how we're forced to organize around education in our communities. And I think what would be helpful for understanding what coalition building would look like is first understanding what those initial organizing steps look like. When you were doing the work that you were doing as those first wave and even second wave of school closings were announced, what did your initial conversations look like with your peers, with the people that you started to build a relationship with to decide to act on what was happening at CPS. What's the beginning of that process like? And you can answer in any order that you want. Just feel free. I guess Jenna.
I'm going to speak from the perspective of more so like a student perspective. So at the time of the school closings, I was actually working in a school that closed, not because of the actions that were taken, but because this school was slated to close anyway. But what I noticed at that time, being a part of that whole movement of school closure, was just the way in which the effects that it had throughout the whole school community. So we were in a shared space where our school was closing and the school that was with us in that building was being phased out. That was one of the decisions that was made. And just the attention that we had to pay to making sure that when our students entered that building, we were providing them with support and understanding, right? Because it's kind of difficult to be a learner in an environment where everything is being shaken up. So one day you have all of these relationships that you've built all the way from the administration down to your peers, and then the next day you know this is going to all go away for me. And some of those students have been there since the very first day that the school opened. So to be in a position now that it's like, what do I do? Where am I going to go? Who is going to be my resource? I've built this great alliance with, you know, Mrs. Such and Such, and now that's going to be taken away from me. What am I doing? So dealing with the emotions of that, of those actions, as well as just trying to foster an environment where we as the adults in the building had to be able to contain that as well. That's kind of, for me, what triggered it in my mind. Like, there has to be something done, because our school was going to close because of funding issues anyway, but all of these other schools that are closing, sometimes schools that are very high performing, schools that have plenty of kids who have been there since kindergarten, now at 7th grade, now being displaced to another school in a community that is not their own. Like, what do we need to do in order to restore the safety, in essence? Like, there's security that is in school buildings. Kids feel safe and connected and tethered to that place, and then to be suddenly uprooted, that to me was very stirring. And same thing with the parents. That was for me, that was the start. So yeah, we'll leave it there.
Yeah, when the first round, I think that for many of us, I think it made it real, how real the struggle was, because back then, just, you know, some years ago, we were working on the school board campaign. We were working on, you know, the mobilizing teachers, and we were working on different campaigns. I was at the time volunteering as a soccer coach in one of the schools. And what made it real is when the announcement happened that they were closing that school where I was working at. And just the overwhelming feeling of the parents and the teachers and the students and their uncertainty. So at the time, I remember we were doing workshops, and I remember we're talking about many things. We're talking about charter schools and the expansion, in particular about the United Neighborhood Organization that was at the time also running ads against the union and obviously attacking the leadership that was actually fighting back. So for us, it was made real when it was a direct attack on the community. So the first conversations I remember having is about local school councils, you know, and going back to the local school council, going back to the parents who represent the president, the community reps, everybody in each council, so the two schools, you know, and going to a lot of the hearings that happened afterward, right? So I think that not only make it real, but it made it personal. Because a lot of the times we see parents with their children late at night, crying, almost begging, right? And that is when that became very, very personal for me. Because it could be, at least for many of us, right, I think that can be you, that can be your family, that can be, and why are we begging for something that we should have in the first place? So I think that is when the fight became, at least in Pilsen and in other communities and we started connecting from the parents locally to the community organizations. Then I learned about the Pilsen Alliance because they were the first people who came and said, okay, what do you need, right? from mobilizing buses to talking to parents. And community organizing is a very difficult thing to do. To understand what do you do, the structures, the power structures, the aldermen, and all these things, and make it, I guess, accessible to parents and the regular people, residents, and so on. So I think, and then connecting to the rest of the city, because we were not in a site. There was like 130 other schools that were in the same situation. So talking to other people in the South Side organizations. So then is when we started connecting to other community groups and, teachers, the CTU, Kenwood Oakland Community Organization. And for me, it was a very eye-opening experience, right? To see not only how bold these undemocratic decisions are, like no matter what we said in hearings or go to the Board of Education, how dismissive they were, and how there will be texting on the phones, and how will be, just kind of being a facade, right? So I think that was the first encounters, and I think what made that really hit the nerve in many of us to say, okay, as a teacher, as a parent, as a community resident, what can we do to help the situation? And not only here, but across the city. So how do we can connect, and how can we fight together?
So the story of NTA is so long and complicated, and actually the Southside Weekly just published an amazing article, came out yesterday by Daniel Motar. So if you want to know the entire sordid story, go to the Southside Weekly, and it's on the front page about why is CPS closing NTA, and you will see that our story is a story of intrigue. It's like you couldn't make up something like this. This is a story of collusion that dates back at least 2010 between wealthy white residents of the South Loop and the alderman and Barbara Byrd Bennett and Rahm Emanuel, even Bob Fioretti when he was the alderman of the 3rd Ward, all talking about NTA, how we should essentially kick out all of the students there and use that building for a high school for good people, for good residents, which, as we know, is code for wealthy white residents. Or else we, as one of the members say, we are going to leave the city. So you better do this for us and make NTA into a high school. And this is going on years before we at NTA even knew anything about it. And there's even evidence in the article will explain how our own principal contacted Alderman Pat Dow and said, I've been hearing these rumors that you want to turn NTA into a high school. Can you let me know what's going on? And she said, oh yes, I've heard that too, but that's not a real plan at this time. So our story, from our perspective of community organizing, just dates back to 1 year ago, when we happened to read in DNA Info, just a bunch of parents, that they were building a brand new elementary school building for South Loop Elementary on 16th and Dearborn, right behind the Marianos. And so if you are sort of familiar with the geography of the South Loop Elementary is our neighboring school. It's on 1212 South Plymouth, basically right behind Dearborn Homes by the Jewel on State and Roosevelt. And we are on the most southern edge of the South Loop at 55 West Cermak and State. Okay, so we're only 10 blocks away. And they want to build a brand new building. They are building a brand new $60 million building behind the Marianos on 16th and Dearborn. And in that article, Alderman Dow says one sentence that scared us. She said something to the effect of, and with this building of the new South Loop Elementary, we are considering changing the boundaries. Now, you have to be aware that South Loop Elementary's boundaries go from Wacker on to the north to 18th Street to the south. Our school, NTA, is 18th Street to 25th Street, where the Stevenson cuts into the drive, and only from the Chinatown overpass, right on the edge of the school, to Michigan. It is a very, very small space. It is so small because when the school was originally built, it was built for the Ickes homes, where there were hundreds and hundreds of children. It was a housing project that then got torn down in this reinvention of the city, and those students got displaced. But they were promised that NTA would always be their home. So while geographically our current boundaries don't have a lot of children in it, our building is full of children because we are the home school for all of these students who were displaced from the Ickies. So when Alderman Dowles made that statement that they were going to move the boundaries, we got scared because you take 18th Street and you move it any place south, we only have 4 blocks to go, right? 18th to 22nd. You will decimate our population. So this was back in March that we read this article of 2017. One of our members, family members, who is a resident of the 3rd Ward, called a meeting with her. And in this meeting, it was a bunch of us, we just showed up. It was very organic. Our story is incredibly organic because we're flying the plane as we're building it. So she calls a meeting with the alderman, and about 10 of us go. And we're like, you said this here, what does this mean? And she's like, yeah, we're thinking about it, I don't know. And at the end of the meeting, she basically said, it's going to happen. Get used to it. And oh, by the way, why don't you write me a letter to justify why you guys need to stay as you are? Justify your existence. So we were like, this is completely unacceptable. I'm sorry, you just want a level 1. We were level 1 at the time. You want a level 1 school to the parents to write you a letter to say why we should stay a school. And so a couple weeks later, in April, there was a 3rd Ward meeting, town hall, just a regular town hall at a church, and Janice Jackson was going to be there. So then we go from 10 parents, right, at the small meeting with Dow, to now we have about 20. We say we're all going to go, and our principal's going to go as well, to this town hall. We're going to try to get some answers. I remember the day, it was like April 20th, 2017. And the conversation is about education, but it was kind of funny because we're all sitting there and we had shirts. We have I Heart NTA shirts, and I have a button on my coat that you can see. It's become our branding now. So there were like 20 people in shirts. And we're all sitting listening to Janice Jackson talk about something else about other schools and education. And Alderman Dowell stands up and she says, just to be clear, we are not talking about Southwood Elementary or National Teachers Academy. You're not in this network. This conversation is not about you. And she sits back down. And we're like, what do you mean? We could ask a question if we want to. And so eventually one of our parents finally stood up and said, because Janice Jackson had made a comment about closing. And she stood up and she just said, speaking of closing, I know this is not about NTA, but I'm sorry I have to ask this question. We've heard that you want to move the boundary for once you build this brand new Southwood Elementary. And Janice Jackson said, actually, you're right. This is exactly what we plan on doing. We'll be moving the boundary. And all of our jaws just dropped to the floor. Our principal was there. This is the first time he'd ever heard of it. We're all texting each other in a group text. What does this mean? Are they saying we just closed? What's going on? And from there, it has been from 20 parents to 25 to 30 to 35 to 50. And it has all been so incredibly grassroots. It's been, we need to have meetings every Wednesday. Who can come? And people just show up. And we as the LSC, we've been championing it in order to protect our staff, for example, to protect our principal. So we've been the ones who have been out there, but it has been so many parents have stepped forward. I'm just amazed at the connections and at the gifts and at the gift of time that our parents have given us. And then later on, we of course end up involving our middle schoolers who are so incredibly eloquent. And then we've been going on protests, and then we've been launching social media campaigns, and we built a website, and we just have been, as our story sort of came out more and more and more, and we started using the media to help to tell our story, then people have been contacting us like, this is terrible, how can we help, how can we help, how can we help? So it's really been this amazing, kind of crazy, but very organic grassroots thing. So sorry for the long explanation, but it's a long story.
Thank you for that context, and thank you for sharing just some of the background of what's been happening in your different schools and neighborhoods. Candace, I wanted to ask you, because a lot of what we have talked about is about people finding out this information through various means, whether from CPS or from random conversations or other avenues. And it spurs organization, it spurs people to come together. But part of this conversation is about the west side and the south sides of Chicago. and when residents gather themselves to organize and what happens. But there's also a narrative around what's different about the South Side and the West Side of Chicago versus communities in other areas of the city that also have opportunities to organize around school actions and what happens there. Can you talk a little bit about the disparity and why it's so important for you in your work as a community attorney to be working in these communities on the South and West Side? What's different about organizing and the ability to push an agenda in these communities versus other more affluent or more privileged communities in the city?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, I think part of it is when I think about being a lawyer, and I think about doing civil rights, I think about where is it most important that I take some of this, quote, power and privilege that I've been able to access through the law and provide that as a resource and a support to the ongoing work. And what has been really empowering for me is the amount of power that is being built in communities that have been most impacted by this, and the effects that it's having on communities, and the ability to channel that into power makes it absolutely the reason why we need to be there among anywhere else. I mean, for me, when I think about my work, my job is not to save people. My job is to, I really believe a core value is empowering. And empowering means what can I do to help build power? What can I do to support the growth of power? And so, for me as a lawyer coming in, it is about how can I be a partner in this work? What can I offer to what you all are talking about, to where you want to go? I'll use the example of National Teachers Academy. One of the reasons why I got connected to it is because that power and that narrative that Elisabeth is telling started to hit the media. And we were sort of in our shop sort of talking about, well, we're hearing a lot right now in this conversation about integration in schools and what is this looking like in the city. So for me, the first thing is let me go where people are at that are most impacted by this and just listen. And so I went to a community meeting at NTA, literally not knowing anyone, and said, I'm just going to show up and I'm going to listen and I'm going to hear what's going on. And from there, we began to share our relative positions, some of the resources, and we began to think about how we could connect together to support the ongoing work. And one of the things that I feel like we can offer as lawyers is a deep understanding of the systems, especially the systems that govern the school action process, but school closings and school systems. And I think when people know that, when people understand that, the ways in which they're able to build power and organize and be strategic is greatly improved. So understanding that when you're in a hearing, you know, who's the real decision maker? Let's have that conversation. Yes, you're sitting in front of a hearing officer, but let's talk about what the law says that they have the power to look at and not look at. So now when you're doing that hearing, when you're at that community meeting, you may be trying to convince that hearing officer, or you may be using it as an opportunity to share your stories and talk to media, because that's really the case that you're setting. You're setting it for the public, because you know that this hearing officer hasn't been empowered to make a real decision, which is very true in school closings. I'll tell you about that later. But I think that can be important because we can get really strategic about, I mean, Elisabeth talks about, you know, and all of you talked about the time it takes for this. It's an incredible amount of effort. So where can we get the most bang for our buck? Where are we really trying to make an impact? Who are we really trying to convince and really connect and organize around that? I think has been pretty important. And so, and I think when I work in community, the ability to do that, the ability to come together to partner in a meaningful way we do result in more power being built, and I think it's important to the work.
So just for all of you, at what point, or was there a point in your organizing and coalition building that you were aware of other similar fights on opposite sides of the city? So was in Austin, for example, did you hear whispers of what was happening in Pilsen or in Inglewood or elsewhere? Did that sort of play into your work? And if so, did it affect your strategy?
Yeah, this is an interesting question because at the time, there are coalitions out there, right? I think there was the grassroots education movement, for instance, right? There's a citywide coalition made of, grassroots organizations and the Chicago Teachers Union who are fighting on, not only for the members, but also not only for the elected school board. But then I think there were some of the first groups to step up to real challenge the big structure, right? A mayor, the aldermen, and the apparatus of CPS and elected school board, and really help us understand the dimension of the issue and to connect the dots. I do think that it is important to build coalitions because then you really see what is happening in your community is also happening elsewhere, right? And how it happens and why it happens, right? So we talk about organizing, the importance of how we can communicate these fights, right, in your own communities. And sometimes learning from other communities is critical, right? And learning from these big systems, right, is so critical. So there were coalitions out there who were working and they continue to work today for an elected school board and the NTA and the many other issues and how we can work in solidarity. Because one thing about empowering that is so critical, right, is just how it is really up to each community. It's about self-determination, right? And it's not about anybody coming and saving us, but it's really saving ourselves. I mean, it's really about empowering the parents, the teachers, the students to come out. And this is a gradual process, right? So when the parents came in, and at first they were just talking to the officers, right? And they're just showing up and just speaking and being themselves dismissed, right? I do think that created also that kind of energy to challenge these outrageous decisions, to know that at the time when they were closing schools, the unelected school board were actually making credits to themselves, right? We have a banker who was making toxic swaps, right? We have charter schools who were, expanding, not because they were doing anything better, but they were actually setting up only schools to failure, to enroll more children in their schools, right? Now we saw it in front of our eyes, right? So I do think it became more and more, but also this was coalition work, right? What charter schools were out there? Who were in this unelected school board, right? What is at stake? I do think that we learned a lot from working in coalition. And I think the lessons and the strategies of how to, I heard, well, in the hearing, are you just gonna be dismissed? Or are you gonna use, you use this to empower parents? Because it's very demoralizing, right? It's very demoralizing to go to a hearing and they don't even look at you, right? But when the parents saw there are people out there that care also like us, right? And they were not only people in our community, but people on the south side and the west side. So I think they grew. So we start bringing more parents to the south side, and parents on the south side will come to, and it became very, very empowering. I do think that the thing to me that I will never forget about organizing is that the time when they had this last hearing, when they give us the runaround in each of the hearings. So this was this last town hall, where they put it outside our area, so make it almost unreachable for parents, or make it more difficult. And I remember hearing the strategy, and all these conversations that were running, not only in our community organizations, but in this coalition, in this table with different groups. And it was, we're gonna target the elected school board, the mayor, and the alderman. And when they came in, right, and after being seen dismissed, I remember we're just trying to help people get in the buses. I couldn't even get in. It was so many people, I couldn't get in, right? I was one of the last ones. So when we saw, and we hear obviously the organizers were saying, when the alderman picks up the mic, we're all gonna boo. And it was so resounding. I will not kid you, he will probably never forget that. Because to have so many people around you to tell you you're wrong, I think that saved the schools right then. Because he couldn't speak. I don't think he ever said a word. Other than, we got to talk about this, right? So I do think that after seeing that, I'm not seeing it from the outside. I think that's what grassroots organizing does. What does working in solidarity does? Because we didn't have resources to bring in buses. We didn't have resources to do a lot of things. But working in solidarity, in coalition, helped us to be able to be there right, to understand the issues and to mobilize for change. And I'm really grateful, so it's not like working alone or working in coalition is so important.
I also think it's important to note that the systems, the people who hold the power they want us to work in silos. They do not want us to work in coalition with each other because they realize that if we can all stay in our own little individual boxes, we will not have as much power as we do when we work together. So there is a system that tries to make it up so that those of us on the South Side don't know what's going on the West Side, or those of us on the West Side don't know what's going on the South Side, and same with the North Side, because we are weaker when we are divided, and we are stronger when we are together. That was part of what made our struggle so difficult, is that we were alone. We were the only school who was slated to be closed for months. The letter that was released to us and to the media came out in May of 2017 and said that we were going to be going through this school action process for the supposed boundary change, which would ultimately result in closing of the school. And we were the only school in the entire city who was initially this was going to happen to. So we had to do this sort of on our own, and we were so all inexperienced. We didn't know anything about any of the other organizations that were out there fighting. We didn't know what we were doing. We just were like, help us. So we were just doing this all by ourselves. It wasn't until December, when they announced Englewood was also going to be closed, that we saw an opportunity to have allies, and that we partnered up with them. And then we reached out to them and said, let's fight together in this. And of course, the organizations that were working with Englewood were very well established organizations. GEM was part of that, and Journey for Justice. And so when we entered into a relationship with them, it was funny. I went to my first meeting with the organization, and I felt like I texted some of my friends. I was like, I feel like we joined the resistance. Like we made it, they let me in. I met some people from Pilsen Alliance, it was just, and these were people who, this is what they do. And so you feel that energy, and so you feel like you are no longer alone. And ever since then, it's been all of us. And so it's been it's exhausting, but it's also very rejuvenating, and you realize how important community is in grassroots organizing. You cannot do it by yourself.
And Simone, can you talk a little bit about the work that you're already doing in schools and how engaging community, engaging those parents, getting them to, for the ones that were already active, but how do you reach those who are perhaps unaware of what's happening to their schools? How do you bring them into the fold?
Well, parents are always a harder pull than the students. So really what you have to do is leverage the relationships that you have with the students. And one thing I'll say, like when I think back to the times in which when I was a part of school closings before, I remember the news was such a huge leveraging point for us, because it was, all of the things that were happening in Austin, but then you can also see on the news that this was happening in Inglewood and other communities like Austin, which then kind of like turned on light bulbs for parents, like, oh, wait a minute, something is not right about what's going on. These communities, that these actions, and I really, that word even just makes me feel some type of way in my soul, like the school actions that are happening, they feel so top down, but that's another story. But so when we started to see that coverage, that was an easier sell. Like, okay, parents, we can do more than complain. We can do more than be upset. We can do more than just, murmur and talk with one another, in passing. So, schools became places of meetings and places that people can come together and understand, okay, here's an organization that's going down to CPS to this meeting. They're having a community meeting on this day. We can get shirts. We can all go. This organization is organizing a bus. How do we get that information out? So it became very relevant once it started to be more than just our school, more than just our community. this was happening, you know, it's 54 schools. That is, yeah, that's still, thinking about it is still like, come on. No, like that is not acceptable. And how do we light the fire so people understand that you don't have to just take school action. You can also take action. So that was really how we got the motivation. Like, look, this is not just us. So it doesn't, like, as you were saying, it's not, we're not siloed. We're not alone here. This is happening all over. And if we do not do more than complain, then we are going to be subjected to whatever decisions are coming down. So even though some schools were still closed, there were some that remained open, and it's because of the voice that we gave to not only our parents, but students as well. Our students were really like, no, something has to be done about this, and in their own ways were very instrumental in bringing the parents along to make sure that voices were heard across the board.
Definitely. So I wanted to sort of underscore before, we have a couple of questions from the audience. So again, if you have questions, you can write them down on the card and pass them to the gentleman over in the corner. So I wanted to just sort of underscore this issue of coalition building and what it can look like, and just using this as an example, especially when we think about what's happening on the South Side and the West Side of Chicago. And so this notion of organizing, a lot of times we organize around issues, but there's also this kind of organizing that we could be doing, which is organizing around values. And if we have shared values, it allows us to supersede particular issues that are very specific to a geography or to a particular, whether it's on housing or if it's in finance or if whatever issue it is. And when you organize around values, that it's wrong to close schools, it's wrong to lie about why schools are closed. Like, we fundamentally believe that that's wrong, whether you live in Garfield Park, in Austin, or in Inglewood, or in Bronzeville. And once we can do that, there is, and I just use this example of being told that what's happening on the South Side is not my fight, right? And if we internalize that, and this is from someone who is in a position of power within the city, then what it does is it allows us to allow what's happening there to happen there. But then when it happens in our neighborhood, what if everyone over on the South Side is saying, well, that's not our fight, right? And that, I think, illustrates why this notion of coalition building is so important and how we can build coalitions around values. I want to ask this question because it gets to something around young people that I think is important for this conversation, and how to get young people involved. So the question is, there is a $95 million police and fire training center that's been proposed in Garfield Park. Youth have been organizing since the summer to fight this and invest in what the community wants, investing in schools, investing in young people. And that fight is called No Cop Academy. It is a hashtag. They have been very, very active on this issue. Primarily, youth have canvassed 500 community members, but what can coalition building and supporting the youth in this campaign look like? And I want to attach that also to your campaigns. What does it look like to support young people who have, by all accounts, been some of the most fearless advocates for their communities, but need some of that support for them to do what they're doing? What does that look like for each of you?
I can start. So I can talk about what does supporting young people look like sort of a little bit more broadly for me in terms of advocacy. Oh, sorry, yeah. I can talk about what supporting young people as a lawyer means to me in advocacy more broadly. I think there is a tendency when we work with young people that we limit their capacity. We limit what they know. We say, oh, it's, sort of thank you, but let the grown-ups talk, or we sort of say, oh, that's a great idea that you're talking about, but that'll never really happen. And so one of the things I think that's really powerful about working with young people is that their vision of what could be is way more radical, open, and they're sort of more audacious in that than a lot of adults are willing to be. And so I think there's a lot to be learned. And then when you're advocating with young people, really supporting them and protecting them so that their voice can be heard. So it's a fine balance, I think. How do you protect young people without sort of closing them off, but understanding that they're growing and they're learning, but they also have real lessons learned, a real voice, and a real experience. And so, and then how can you elevate that with the privilege and power that you have as an adult, right? How can you create spaces for young people to be heard? How can you lift up young people's voices in the room? So when you're in a space, yeah, you've invited them to a meeting, but when they speak, do you listen and do you ask and put attention on them so that others are listening? And so really thinking about your power and your privilege as the adult in the space. But in our work, we do support many young campaigns by young people, and it's been incredibly powerful, and it teaches me a lot about what advocacy looks like and the bounds in which I get comfortable and start to create limitations on what is possible, just because you get jaded after a while. You've lost so many times. You start to make small what you think is even possible, but young people can really push you to want and to ask for more.
So I think, in my experience, at the basic level, the first thing to me is that we have to get our young people to care about the issues that affect them and the world that they're living in. A lot of times I've noticed that because young people get so many directives, so many people telling them what to do, how to do it, you know how adults are. You don't know nothing, you still a kid, all those things. Those messages, those become internalized by our young people, and they don't always care to do anything because they feel like, what's the point? I'm not going to be able to. This isn't something that I can affect. Just adultism, or whatever you would call it, because we are such a society that typically gives directions to our young people versus listening, hearing, and inviting them into conversations and using them as our thought partners, or empowering them to make decisions on things that are important, not just on the level of, that's so cute, we're going to take that idea and we're going to make it grown-up idea, but really listening, because the ideas that they have are so different a lot of times from ours. Same goal, different means of getting there. Also, something that I've noticed is that young people a lot of times like to, because of same thing I'm talking about, I think a lot of times young people want to please the adults that they are working with, and that, again, it is squelching to what they can actually do. So first of all, I think we have to get them to have some fire, okay, this is something that you don't like, this is something that you see as disparity or dysfunctional, let's talk about that, let me rev you up, okay, let me hear that, let me hear what you got going on in your head, let me, let's stir that thing, and then from there, we can empower them by listening. First of all, we need to let them know that these spaces are available for their voices to be heard, and not in this way where I'm gonna now translate your thoughts into something else, and now I can share it because, you may not say it eloquently. Who cares about that? That doesn't matter. So I think on our side as adults, we have to create the space and make it big enough for them to exist there, because sometimes we try to box young people in as if they don't know enough, but they know a lot and they feel a lot and they can do a lot. So for me, it is, getting that fire lit within them, making sure that they care about the thing, and then saying, all right, well, let's light it up then. What can we do with that? So,
and I just wanted to add something very quickly. That how difficult it is also to organize the youth, right? I think that's when I grown a lot, because most of my experience being always with parents or teachers, and not as much. And I think that is in today's time, during today's times, I think if we think about, the Laquan McDonald case, right? Where we think about there was only one alderman who voted no for the Now Cup Academy, right? And the police brutality, and what happens in our schools, the constant, the school to prison pipeline. Where young people go, especially in our Black and brown communities, what they go through on a daily basis. It is, and when we start really truly talking about transformative, and talk, what a day to talk about transformative, radical work, right? So an organization like the Pilsen Alliance, which is small, but is really talking about systemic change, talk about, how we deal with gentrification, how we deal with school cuts, how do we find accountability, how we push the envelope. Our young people have responded. The first people who have responded so overwhelmingly are our young people. And to really create spaces that are safe, that are actually empowering for them, it requires, for many of us, I think, a learning of the whole thing. I mean, in our organization today, they push us, and they will push hard, and then they should, because I think they're there to dream, and sometimes we just accept the norms. So I think that to see them fighting, to see they were talking, young people to understand policy, to go say, today we have 75% of the people in Chicago said yes to lift the ban on rent control, right? But in our organization, who made that, a lot of that happens, a lot of young people from high schools who came and were door knocking for their families, for their schools, right? So to see how hard they work, but they want to be led by their own, right? So, and it makes it more powerful. So right now we're actually trying in a small budget, how do we create a budget that is youth-led? How do we really support them to have a voice, and we're not telling them what to do? And they check, and I really have learned to check without getting so upset about when there's a space to say, like, well, this is very oppressive and this is very adultist on your part, right? And I think that it's good to check ourselves and say, what, how can we learn and create these spaces? Because they're hurt. And when they're hurt, they are feeling the pressure, and what's happened next with like student debt. I mean, there's so many issues out there, and we owe to our youth these spaces and how we can humble ourselves to create them. I think there's a question that we grapple constantly, and we got to work hard, I think, and support each other, Oftentimes, we see a lot of organizations and to collaborate. Hey, I heard about this opportunity for young people. Hey, how to work in solidarity really can help us unite our young people, So now we have in the Pilsen Alliance, I was very proud to see not only Pilsen Alliance talking about the issues in our community, because we do still have violence, but also talking, teaming up with the Asada's daughters and said, okay, how do we address this as a group, as a coalition? And then see Asada's daughters taking on ICE. There was an action, with our young people went, and they were, advocating for undocumented young people. How powerful that is. And this happens in youth-led spaces, and I think that at the extent that we learn to do this work, we'll see more and more, the walkouts and so on. I feel optimistic because of the youth, and I hope that we can create more and more spaces like that will empower them.
Just quickly, our experience has been a little bit different because we have elementary school students, so it's been, they're amazing. They have so much to say, our middle schoolers, but they're also 12 and 13. So a lot of what we've done for them is to create the work within the structure to make it okay for them to do a walkout, or to go to City Hall, or to go down to the board in the middle of the school day. So we get permission slips. We have chaperones. And I've never done it because the thought of having to chaperone 20 8th graders on the Red Line downtown and back terrifies me. But that's what some of our parents have been doing. So that's the way we support our kids, because they've got so much to say. And we sign them up to speak at the Board of Ed, unelected, school board, which again is another, a process that is completely undemocratic, and it does not allow for all voices. But we do that for them. And then we get them there, and then we just say, go at it. And then they just speak. So when you're dealing with elementary school students, we have to do more within the structure to keep them safe, but once you do that and you get out of the way and let them speak, it's incredibly powerful.
So I have a couple of questions that have come in that I think are important, and I want to make sure that people have this information before we open it up to general Q&A. So the question is, would you speak a bit more about the basics? What are the motives and some of the politics, more specifically, behind these school closings? And so I'm going to field that question to you with the 2013 closings. For those of us who are involved, the reason changed every other day, but we'll talk about that. And then the ones from this past year that just happened. So can you speak about the specifics, the politics behind the school closings?
I'll speak a little bit about what the alleged problem was, and people can add in about some of the politics around that. But one of the big issues is that Chicago has shifting populations, right? And there have been a lot of policies that have contributed to moving people, displacing people, kicking people out outright. And so populations have changed. Also, just over time, populations have changed. You know, some areas that were much more dense are not as dense anymore. And so you do have a reality of schools that used to be sort of bursting at the seams with students, now having a lot less students, but sort of add a layer of introducing choice into the mix. And so now you're creating avenues for students to move from what would have been their neighborhood schools. And so you're actually creating some systems that are leading to further underutilization of schools. And then the other big area that was talked about for school closings is underperformance, a combination of underutilization and underperformance. And again, you have lots of policies and practices that were created and that really made it really impossible for schools to succeed under those conditions. If you don't have the funding, if you have a high transient population of students in your area, you have lots of other issues going on, whether it's community violence, community health issues, all of those things are going to be a recipe for disaster for your school. And so what happened, especially around the 50 school closings, was this snapshot of schools and saying, all of a sudden, we have to take some drastic action because of finances, because of all of these things. We have all of these underutilized schools, all of these underperforming schools. We have no idea how they got that way. But we have to do something about it, and this is the thing that we're going to do. We're going to close. And originally on the list was, it was well over 50 schools. I think at one point I saw something like 300 schools were identified, and then they began to narrow down. The challenge with that is that the conversation about how we got that way and the ownership around that is not a part of that conversation. It's the snapshot of the problem and then the sort of sense of this is the solution, and this is the solution that we know will work best for our city, and we're going to move forward with such a heavy hand without really consulting community, without having a deeper conversation about whether there are any other options that are more equitable, that support communities. We don't have the time for that all of a sudden. And so, I mean, from our vantage point, I mean, we see the rules, underutilization, underperformance as big indicators of schools that are sort of set up to be sort of identified as schools to be closed. But then the question becomes, how did our schools get that way? Where is the conversation about the politics and the policies that created these conditions?
I think it is important to see and track the power dynamics and the money, right? And if you look at, the decisions of an elected school board, right? A banker who was giving his bank money on toxic swaps that cost our schools millions of dollars. I mean, this is not, or there was another board of a board member who was selling furniture to the schools, furniture that they were not needed, that was benefiting her own company, but just excusing themselves from voting and thinking that was okay. I mean, millions of dollars being drained from our public schools. Charter schools, and I like to give examples because I think that really give us a sense of how wrong these decisions are. The United Neighborhood Organization that now had changed their name because they're so awful, right? And how the outrageous things that they were able to do. By the way, the former CEO of that charter network, Rahm Emanuel's campaign last time around. I mean, these are people, and I don't recall any even principal who has the time to run a mayoral campaign and being principal at the same time. And we are talking about a CEO who was running 16 schools. Incredible. And the outrageous things that happened obviously after that, right? I think it's about construction deals, right? About how they were expanding, they were building new schools while they were closing others. They were built, and how these contracts happened. So these people were actually contracting themselves. So we have VPs and other employees who were contracting for windows. So all of a sudden, the nice windows that all these schools had, it started making a lot of sense. Because many of us said, well, why do they have so many windows, right? So, and then we start seeing, the atrocities that go, and money is spent now directly in politics, right? These groups financing particular politicians and particular decisions and mobilizing people. I tell you a story. When we, and this is 2012, 2011, when this group was extremely influential, not only in school, and I don't know how they became educators all of a sudden, but this group, there was a very political group that was, a Hispanic Democratic organization, somehow they actually followed charter school to benefit the politics and expand, because as one of the executives says, this was about loyalty, about, expanding their schools and having more power. And the terrible cost that meant for us kids. These schools didn't have, in the school in the schools that they were targeting mainly brown children, they did not have bilingual teachers. It was incredible. They did not have a special education or adequate special education when they were taking kids away from public schools to promise them better services. This is criminal. What this group did is criminal, right? And I think that, and today, right, when they discovered that the bonds that they sold and there was a whole network of corruption linked back to the mayor and the Board of Education, still today have not been punished. They give him a slap in the wrist, right? Some of these people should be convicted, right? But because of the system that we have today, we let some of these people still be in office, right? But I do think that if and what happened on Tuesday, I think is a wake-up call, right? For hopefully that we have to pay attention a lot of how the money is spent. It's not about education for many of them. It's not about doing the right thing. And these are children. In these schools today, we have 7,000 plus children whose schools are underfunded because of these terrible decisions that were made. So we should never forget about what has happened. But I think a lot of this has to do with the contracts and who finance their campaigns and construction and all these deals. But it never had to do with education. And I think now unfortunately, we see like what the cerebral charter schools, how such of a fallacy that was, and how it has hurt our public schools.
So you just basically spoke truth to power, and what you just said is NTA, because what has happened is moving goalposts, right? These previous reasons why we closed the school for under enrollment and for underperformance is not the reason why we're closing NTA. There's actually not a reason why we're closing NTA except corruption, except that someone had a private meeting with the mayor and said, we need a high school. And, oh, by the way, our zoned high school of Phillips is too black and too poor for us to send our children to. We're not going to do it. So build us our own school or we're going to leave the city. And so that's what's happening here. So that is how we got here, is through backroom deals, is through a law that has no teeth, right? And is through just general corruption, an unelected school board and a mayor who has all of the power.
There's a lot in what was said. So I hope that you're processing all of this and have a better understanding of the depth of the politics that go into the decisions that people make and what it means for communities who have to respond to those various levels. And so I want to ask this other question because it's tied to everything that you've all just heard. And the question is, what can we do to be proactive rather than reactive about school closings, to get ahead of them before they've already slated schools to close? So how can we be proactive? And I guess I'll just give an example of what happened on the West Side this year, as those of us who work in education are seeing what's happening at NTA, we're seeing what's happening in Inglewood. We're having these meetings with elected officials on the West Side because we're like, we don't want to go through that. We have to see what's happening on the South Side and what can we learn from that so that we can avoid and at least learn from the experience of the organizers on the ground, so that we can plan and always try to be at least one step ahead, because far too often as organizers, we find that we're constantly trying to catch up, trying to get the right information, trying to find out when the meeting is, who hosted the meeting, who do we listen to, what can we do as organizers, and what do you do to be as proactive as possible given the circumstances?
I had an initial response, but I'm not an organizer. So, but just thinking about what happened and really analyzing what we're looking at. So one of the things about the 49 school closings of 2013 is that they categorically took off high schools. And so immediately my fear and my worry is that after the moratorium, we're going to be talking about high schools in a much more aggressive way. So it wasn't that high schools were less or were more utilized, that they were more well performing. They just categorically took it off. And so we still have high schools that are underutilized, underperforming. So if there's ever going to be a push again, I think that it would be targeted towards high schools. The other thing about, and I wanted to say this earlier, the other thing about when you work in coalition, I think it pushes you to think about solutions at a higher level beyond just saving your individual interest or your individual school in this case. So we can, by working in coalition, we can begin to challenge and ask ourselves what are the systems and the conditions that even create this to be possible. So as a lawyer, one of the things I think about is the hearing process. Having gone and worked with NTA as they went through that hearing process, I do not think that community could have done anything better than the advocacy and the organizing that they were doing. I mean, it was outstanding. Anybody who was in that room, I don't know how you walked away feeling like this was an okay decision, that this was the right decision. So organizing was not the problem there, it was the process. It was absolutely the process. You were going to community meetings that didn't feel like anyone was there to hear you. You were going before a hearing officer where you get a report back where they spent 80 pages talking about all of the testimony that everyone talked about and 2 pages on the analysis of what their decision was, which was CPS complies, CPS complies, CPS complies, CPS comply. And just as a lawyer, I'm like, this is garbage. This is not an analysis. You gave no reasoning. Yeah, and the thing is, the hearing officer's job in that, by law, is not to analyze this case, right? They don't even have the power to do it. And so elevate the conversation. So really we are talking about a process that's fundamentally broken. This is not a process that allows you to engage community. This is not a process that's meant for you to be able to advocate successfully. So that's part of the target, is the process, the very rules which create the conditions. And I think when you work in a coalition, you're working around values and you're connecting, you can begin to elevate some of those solutions at how do we change the very process in which these things are connected. And so I think those are some of the targets I would think about, and where groups can really begin to organize and think ahead. How can we make the process, the systems, the rules, the way these things are written better so that we're more successful?
I think these are critical times to get involved, right? And I think that there are different spaces, neighborhood-based organizations, but also that, there's research. There's great organizations like Chicago United for Equity. They need advocates, right, and all sorts, and they help us a lot, right? Who advocates for these parents? Who advocates for the most vulnerable? Who advocate for communities that may so their the roles as a teacher, as a lawyer, as a student. There's a critical need for insurgency in a times where the attacks are brutal. The attacks on our youth, on our parents, the atrocities, the undemocratic decisions that are made on a daily basis will be responded in kind when we mobilize a great amount of people. And I think that today we're getting there, but I do think that also, I always think that these agendas, and these are a particular group and particular politicians, right, who also know the responses. And I think that there's a clear attack on the Black community. 88% of the school closings happen on the west and the south side, right? Child expansion, right? And I remember the first lesson that I got from, this, very simple. A mom, an elder told me, well, when I start seeing charter schools in rich neighborhoods, I believe this is real, right? And it was true, right? I was like, yeah, you make absolute sense, right? So it is important that we start making ourselves involved to question these things and to make sure that we're involved in whatever capacity, right? But to get involved at your neighborhood, school, right? There today, the local school councils, they have a lot of power. The parents sometimes are not informed of how many, and obviously politicians are very well aware of this. So oftentimes they have their staffers, they have their people, right, to control, or the administrators. So when something happens, these things are shut down immediately, right? So I think that if we get involved, and I see more people getting involved with no other agenda than trying to get good education for our children, to get good education, to make sure that we have good schools. So at your local school, at your local organization, or organizations that are doing some advocacy, there's a real need. I mean, and honestly, every time I hear the outrageous lies that are happening, not too long ago I was like reading, oh, we're doing fantastic, 7,000 more condos have been built in downtown, right? And then you see like 250,000 people just left the city. How can you talk about success, right? Like our schools are crumbling, you're counting on funding, you're strangling us, right? So how can we talk about success in these times? So only when we get together and get involved, we'll be able to challenge, these decisions and get democratic institutions.
So this question is a little political. It's actually for Byron. I guess it's for me too, but I'll let you answer the question. So it says, two of you ran for office in 2014. How would things be different today had you both won? Things would have been completely different. I can say that. I can say that unequivocally across the board. But I think it's, running for office is a tool. Again, we fight these fights at various levels. And so some of us are at the grassroots. Some of us are the scholar activists. Some of us are called to serve in public office because we actually believe in public service. And so running for office is just a mechanism, because when you're doing this organizing work, you run up against these walls so often and spend so much time trying to convince people to have the values that you have. And when people have fundamentally different values, the way that they vote will reflect their values. And so a lot of times, part of what it requires to usher in the changes that we're trying to seek or trying to enact requires people who share your values and decision-making positions on the other side of the wall. And so that, for me anyway, that's the point of public service. It's in service of the people that you claim that you want to represent. And when you have different values, it's reflected in policy. Policy does not pop up out of nowhere. Policy is a direct reflection of the priorities and the values of an institution, whether it's a city, a school district, et cetera. And so to change the policies and to change the culture requires changing the people so that they have the values that reflect. And so you can imagine what the city would be like with someone who actually valued public education, who valued communities equally, who valued this notion of equity in education. What kind of city would we live in? To me, that vision is what would encourage someone like me, who's very much more a grassroots organizer, to actually run for office. So Byron, I don't know if you have a...
And I think that is, I do think, and in honesty, right, I do think that the grassroots is so important. I do feel that back then, I didn't know a lot of, in fact, that's why I think we were only 70 votes away from maybe challenging a runoff, because it was so critical. But I do think that I did not know a lot of things that, because of the grassroots work that we're doing, I'm more aware, more rooted, a little more connected now. With that said, I do think that electoral politics is also important. I do think, as an organizer, I feel very fortunate to be able to be connected to the community and serve in one capacity. I do feel that that's rewarding. I do not feel how a politician wakes up every day knowing what the decisions they were made, right? So I think that today I would feel if things would not have gone the way they did, I wonder, if I would be really equipped to provide solutions, right? Because I think that the problems that we have are astronomical. I do think, like, if you name it, the displacement, the pension system, like a lot, but they can be solved. So I do think that we will be fighting, like what I can say, we'll definitely have another vote for the No-Cop Academy. That's one, right? Because it's a common sense things, right? I think that there are things that we can do. We'll definitely, in terms of development, aldermanic power is very real. It would be great to have Amara as a mayor, right? I do think that we will definitely not have the atrocities that continue to see, right? And I will say that definitely we have to challenge two things that I think are very important. One, like on Tuesday we got I think less than 30% of people actually voted. That's horrible. That's just unacceptable. to engage more people. I do think that we need to work on engaging more people, right? To vote, to just do something as simple as participating. And I think, among the young people, it was more abysmal. And I don't blame him, because I think the options that we have, they're from bad to worse, right? So I do think that it is important that we challenge, and we should never apologize to challenge the status quo, right? I give a funny story, right? Because sometimes the young people say like, but you don't even speak good English, what the hell are you gonna do, right? But it was the power that goes with that, right? Because you dare to challenge, right? And I think that we have to remember that, right? And when people say, well, politics are dirty, politics, you should not do that, or they always win, or whatever that is, right? We have to challenge that. And I think by doing it and setting the example, we should never apologize for that. We should never apologize for trying for public service. I'm actually, honored to be with you, with Amara again, and actually had that question written, right? So I do think that if we can really not only talk about organizing is very critical, but also challenge the electoral power. We need both, right? And I think we need to respect both for their, for better or worse, right?
Thank you. So we have time for a couple more questions, and now I want to open it to the audience. So this is an excellent question, actually. Are there situations where closing a school is the right thing to do, i.e. when there are less than 100 students and enrollment has declined over many years, or where students have not been learning and have fallen behind? So are there situations where closing a school is the right thing to do?
I would say that the answer to that, on a very simple level, would be yes. It makes sense to not, if in fact we do have a school that is underutilized and underperforming in the actual context, and there is no corruption that is involved in that, then of course, we want to make sure, because as to Byron's point, we are here to make sure that our kids get the best possible education possible. And if the space that they are in at that time is not going to be able to give that to them, then of course we want them to get somewhere that they're going to get what they need to get. However, if that is the case, there is a right way to do things. So if a school has to close for these reasons that were listed on this question, then there's a way to make that a process that is not a process that does not feel like a consequence, if that makes sense. So we want to, this is about providing opportunities for our children to thrive. So we don't want, if in fact the school is very underutilized and the kids are not getting the education that is fit for them, and that school has to close, we want to make sure that when that occurs, that our students don't leave out of that school feeling like someone just, messed over them. That's not the message that needs to be sent. So if there's reason, real reason, not corruptive reasons that are said to be real reasons, but if there are real reasons, then yes, because we do have to remember the whole point is to make sure that our kids are getting the best possible education that they can get. So that would be my opinion on that.
One thing that pops up to me is who gets to make that decision and how is that decision made, right? So the answer could be yes, but who gets to come to yes, and how do we come to yes? And to the point that you were making about corruption, that's really the heart of the issue, is that these decisions are made on communities. The communities don't feel included. How they're made are in isolation, without consideration of how we came to this problem, without deeper ideas for solutions. So closing a school can be one option. It is not the only option when you're dealing with underutilization and low performance. And are the other options even put on the table? Who gets to be included in that conversation? When you come up with the idea, who do you check with? Who owns the school, right? Asking those critical questions to me are so important if the answer is going to be yes, right? And unfortunately, we don't do that. That is not the process that we have. We don't include people in that process, or we don't include the people that are most impacted by the decisions in that process. And that's where, I don't care what the answer is, we get it wrong every time because we didn't we didn't deal with those questions first.
So the last question for all of you is, what is the ask if groups or coalitions organize around values rather than events? What is the ask? And I'll contextualize it just to help get the wheels turning. So what do we ask our parents? What do we ask our schools? What do we ask our kids? So that we can organize around values, not just when we're being acted upon. What do we ask of them in this work?
I think one question to ask or to get to is, what do we want to build? What do we want to see? Being able to talk about where things are challenged for us, where there are problems, but offering a space for us to talk about what do we want to build? What are the solutions that we want to see in our community? Why are those decisions outsourced out of our communities, right? Why are the conversations about building happening somewhere else and not in our communities? Why aren't we at the table consistently? So to me, I think that's really important. I think communities can sit with the exact same questions that folks down at City Hall are sitting with, right? You know, this neighborhood is underinvested in. Like, what do we want to build? How are we going to build this for us? The challenge is that how do we create power around those conversations when community are having them? There's plenty of power downtown when two people are having them, right? You know, a couple people pulled some data. So I think part of the ask is, just what do we want to build, and then how do we get there?
I think one of the things that for us is important is we need, the ask is to let's build a vision, a different vision than what we currently have, but because we know it's failing us, right? So how we build this vision at the local level. All politics are local, right? So we cannot expect, and that's the thing, my problem with grass stops organizing is because you haven't built anything that we don't even understand sometimes, I think at the grassroots level, talking to regular people, right, people who are affected directly, and working in solidarity, we can really, truly build solidarity movements that really speak to the needs of the everyday person, right, the everyday student, the everyday teacher, the people from the rest. And I think that we learn, what is our role. So I think in a vision, we all have a role. I don't believe in the polar, there's just some people who maybe can do this. I don't know. But I do think that everybody has a role. And I think if we really, truly going to challenge and create a new vision, a new social imaginary that will preserve the identity of our communities, the beauty of our communities, it won't come if we isolate ourselves or think that we are self-righteous, right? I do think and I think sometimes that's I think there were some times where we are, angry and we're upset and the frustration is very real, right? I think our nature is just to hit back, right? But I do think that when we sit down and we have a vision that we all can agree on, right? And that we really truly think we are in true solidarity, not only here in Pilsen, but in the south side and west side and north side, right? And we can truly do this better. I think that we will bring optimism. We will bring real hope, right? Not as a cliche phrase, right? Not as like a slogan, but something real, something people can say, yes, this is going to work because it's built with us. So if it's not with us, it's not going to be about us, right? So I do think the ask is for different people, when someone has privilege, let's check our privilege to see how we sit to this table, right? And sometimes we're impatient, right? Because these are processes that take time. We haven't got here overnight, right? So it's going to take time, and we have to be patient of how things move. And sometimes it's not easy, and sometimes we say, okay, well, I'm tired now. We're going to make a commitment to these things, to make sure that we are actually working for change. And structural change is very difficult and challenging, and it challenges personally. And imagine what is challenging a neighborhood, what is challenging a whole city. But if we can do it locally, I am absolutely confident that we will challenge the status quo, and we will come together, one community at a time.
I think the biggest ask is don't give up. I think, in particular, if you are a native of Chicago, like I am, you sometimes feel as though this is the way Chicago works, right? Chicago works. And the one phrase that we heard over and over again with NTA when the decision came out from our own families, it's a done deal. It's a done deal. There's nothing we can do about it. Particularly when you're talking about people who have had things done to them their entire lives, right? Those who are disenfranchised, as many African Americans and many people are throughout this city, right? Black and brown people, we get moved around, right? We get things taken away from us. We get told, no, you can't go there anymore. No, we're raising your rent. No, we're taking away your Section 8. We're putting you over there. You know, you can't go over there anymore. And so for many of our families in our community who've had this happen to them over and over and over again, this is just one more thing that they can't change. And so the one message that I kept trying to impress upon everyone is that it is not a done deal. It's not over. We don't give up. And this is the stage that we're in right now because our action is not supposed to happen until September 2019. So we have plenty of time to break this, and we will break it, all right? We are not going down. NTA will be there. I have a son who's going to be in kindergarten in September, and he's going to graduate from NTA, period, right? We're not going anywhere. But that continued fight, like you say, it's long. And when you think about it, it's like, I can't believe it's going to be my life for the next, I don't know how many years. I can't maintain this level of energy and anger, But I feel as though I have to do it because there are so many other families who just want to give up. So we have to be out there, those of us who are engaged in grassroots organizing, to at least, even when we don't feel it ourselves, when we're tired, we just tell them, no, you can do it. We can do it together. This is not the way it has to be. The Chicago machine can be broken, right? And we can break it. And we'll be tired, and we will take a lot of energy, and there'll be a lot of defeats, but ultimately we can win this. So I think that's the biggest ask that we who are on the ground level ask, I think, of everyone.
I would just add, I second all of the things that have been said, but the thing that I would add is just this value of doing it for us. So not just thinking about, as was mentioned earlier, not just thinking about your community or your family or your neighbors or your children, but doing it for us. This is something that has to be done to make this city better. So it's not just about, even if you were successful in fighting against your action, there are still people who are losing this fight or, getting weary in this battle. And we need to understand that it does take everyone, and we are all, if anybody can be affected, we all can be affected. So for me, it would be, let's do this for us, not just for you.
Thank you so much. Can we give our panelists a round of applause? It's excellent. We have time for a couple of questions from the audience before we break. So I think Jennifer will facilitate that process. So if you have a burning question, we have time for a couple.
Thank you so much. If you could have a dream coalition, maybe you could vision for us a bit what a dream coalition, who would you be on your team for a greater Chicago coalition to affect these changes?
So the question is essentially, what does the dream team look like? For Chicago coalition building, what does that look like? Who do you want on your starting lineup, if you will? It's Loyola played tonight, by the way, guys. So I don't know the results yet, but that's just a shout out to the March Madness. Yes.
You want names?
Organizations, perhaps some of the ones that you're already working with, that you've had good results with. Well, what does that look like?
I think, and I'll give you an example. I think that might be the best way, because otherwise I'll be like, oh, it'll be hard. It's a hard question. The Leave the Bank Coalition, right, is fairly new. And it has geographically a very interesting composition, right? There are 4 groups, right? The Northside Action for Justice, Hope Center, Kenwood Oakland Community Organization, and Pilsen Alliance. If you look at those 4 organizations, right? The Uptown, Bronzeville, Kenwood, Hyde Park, Pilsen. You cover interesting, not only geographically, demographically, right? You have, and that same coalition, right, that a year ago was ignored by a lot of people, right? They were like, you're crazy, this is never gonna happen, right? And a year later, those 4 organizations, right, were able to shift the narrative, right? That's the power, and I think you can call it Rainbow Coalition, you can call it many things, right? But I think that is the power coming together out of, true love for the community, right? And I can tell you that for everybody who's in the room, and sometimes we don't agree, right? And sometimes it's not easy to work in coalition, right? We don't want to idealize it. It's hard, right? Because we have different realities and different things, some harder than others, and that's true. But I do think that we could never question, the passion and love for the work, right? That we all come there, and if anybody has that, I think we should never reject anybody. And oftentimes I see that, and it's sad, right? Everybody should be welcome to join the fight at every capacity. There's no little thing that is too little or not too big, it's too big. Every little action takes a big thing, and I'm very proud because on Tuesday there was 75% of people say, yes, that makes sense, right? In the tower, people say like, it's like kind of crazy, right? I do think that that's the kind of coalition that can move us forward, right? And I think that we still have a lot of work to do. To me, to be here in this panel is very personal because we cannot take away the fact that there are 50 schools yet. I mean, there's some optimism, right? But there's a commitment, I think, also that goes along with that. Because 50 schools, they were closed, and there were 4 more that are still fighting today. So making that commitment, right? To say, you know what, no, 1 more, right? And I think that if we can bring the coalition, and it starts like in groups like this, right? Where do I plug in, right? There's a struggle right now that needs help, right? Let's do it. Let's get committed. Let's get this coalition going.
Other questions, or one other question?
Hello? Oh, sorry. This question might be a little too reactive, but we were just wondering where, in the schools that close, where do the students go?
So the question is, for the schools that have closed, where do the students go? Where do they end up?
I can just speak from what I know. They end up a little bit of anywhere, really. So particularly in Austin, I know that they took a lot of the huge building schools with, 500 kids or whatever, put them in a smaller space, trying to say, oh, there's plenty of space for all these kids in this space. So, you go from 8 schools in the community to 4. So that was that particular community. The school that I particularly was working at, when it closed, our kids went to so many different schools. I could not sit here and tell you where they are. And that work to get them, because here's the thing too, that I don't know if is expressed enough. When you have, especially for high school, I can speak for that because that's where I work primarily. There are neighborhood schools, so within your boundaries, you have a spot in that neighborhood school because that is for you. If you do, a lot of times, families don't always feel so positively about the neighborhood school, which means that it is that family's struggle, fight, action, whatever you want to call it, to get their children into a school that is not that neighborhood school. Because they don't, there are some perceptions that are saying, oh no, you can't go there, that's not the way it goes. But then you have to then say, what school has space for my child to go to? Especially once they reach a certain grade level. In high school, you can probably get into another school in 9th grade, but once you start matriculating, they're like, we have, let's say 9th grade has 10 spaces available for new students, 10th grade may have 5 spaces, 11th grade may have 1 space, seniors, no spaces, but with an exception, if you're our neighborhood boundary, we have to take you, those sorts of things. So kids can be going anywhere. anywhere.
One thing I wanted to add is that, so by law, when they close a school, they're supposed to designate a school that's higher performing for the students to go to. And there's research to support that when students do leave and go to higher performing schools, they can have better outcomes. The challenge, though, is that the research says significantly higher performing, and that doesn't always happen at all. And so sometimes we're talking about schools that were level 3, and a higher performing school is just, the step above. It's not a significantly higher performing. And then just because performance works for, we also have to think about equity in that and what students' needs are and the differing needs of students. And so a lot of times where students end up, a question about whether they're actually better off than their low-performing, underutilized school is a question of equity, a question of what they need in order to be successful. And a lot of students are dealing with the trauma of closing, right? Being told that your school wasn't good enough, that you weren't, who's in a school? Kids are in a school, you're not performing, right? And do we ever deal with that? Do we provide the supports around that? And so, absolutely right. A lot of kids don't go to the welcoming school that's designated, and sometimes they go to other places. Some parents get totally fed up and they actually leave neighborhoods because they feel like this is just step one to continue disinvestment. So that's a big question, but the answer is absolutely everywhere. But there are designated schools, but whether they go there or not is a different question.
I just recently read an article. There are few thousand students who are actually missing from that they actually don't know where they are. So whether their families moved out of state or moved out to the suburbs, we just don't know. The system has lost so many students, but during that transition, they just lost track of a few thousand students. Also, I want to speak really quickly to, in our particular situation, NTA was a receiving school for another school, Price, where we received 60 middle schoolers. And it is not only detrimental, of course, to students who are being displaced, but also to the receiving school. And this was before my time there, but our principal, this was his first year there as a principal on top of it. As a result of it was so problematic. Our school rating actually dropped to a level 3 because this integration plan to get the students integrated into one school, it doesn't work. It does not work. And so it is incredibly detrimental, not only to the students who are being displaced, but then also the students who are in the current receiving school. And there's culture clashes, and there's neighborhood boundaries that have to be crossed. And sometimes, when you're talking about high schools, you got gang situations going on. It's a terrible situation. And it is not at all in anyone's best interest to do things this way. The very last thing is that for NTA's situation, we are being converted into a high school because, as I mentioned, and Janice Jackson has told us that Phillips Academy on Pershing and King Drive is not a viable option for families in the South Loop. So you can interpret that as you would like. But also know that for the now they are being phased out, but originally the 4 Englewood high schools that were going to be closed, guess what their receiving school was? Phillips, because it is a good educational option for the black children in Englewood. They can go to Phillips, but Phillips is not good enough for the wealthy white South Loopers. So it's very coded, it's very racially divided, it's very inequitable, it's incredibly unfair, and also we have a system then that perpetuates that. Right, that continues to disenfranchise our families, that continues to tell one population, no, you don't have to go there, that's not right for you, but telling another population, oh yeah, that's fine, that's a good choice. They have got a good sports team, it'll be fine. So it really is, it's a mess. It's just a mess all around.
I don't really want to end it on that note.
Sorry,
just kidding. No, but this has been an incredible conversation, and there's a lot here. I'm hoping that if you have the program, that you can do more research into each of the individuals here and the organizations that they represent, and just learn about what they have going on. And if you can, if you want to learn more to support what they're doing, I also want to, just as a final note, provide encouragement to all of you in this work. It is incredibly difficult to organize. It's incredibly difficult to be an organizer in the city of Chicago. And it is incredibly difficult to climb a mountain that you don't know when or if or how you will make it to the top and who's going to be with you when you get there. So I want to encourage all of you in the work that you're doing. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your expertise and your experience and your wisdom with all of us. And I'm hoping that we can give you another round of applause for what you shared with us.